1973 was a pivotal year in the development of China as an international actor. It was the year of rapprochement between the United States and China. On the American side, led by Henry Kissinger and President Nixon. On the Chinese side, led by Chairman Mao and Prime Minister Zhou Enlai. But the Chinese wanted not only a rapprochement with the United States, they wanted to have influence in the wider world. To try to do this, they sought to develop what was later called the Chinese three-world theory. But they wanted to announce this theory in a certain kind of way which was sympathetic particularly to Africa. So in 1973 itself, President Kenneth Kaunda, the founding president of Zambia, was visiting Beijing, and he was entertained by both Chairman Mao and by Zhou Enlai. And the Chinese waited till after Mao's meeting with Kaunda before they announced their three-world theory, saying it had been very heavily influenced by the philosophical wisdom of Kenneth Kaunda. At that point in time, even in Britain, the former colonial power, he and others like Julius Nyerere of Tanzania were regarded as the new philosopher kings of Africa, using the Greek ideal of a ruler who was wise. Now, in some ways, this was a compensation for all of the years of denigration of the thoughtless African. Suddenly, they became philosopher kings. But in the case of both Nyerere and of Kaunda, of others also, like Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah, there was genuine thought. Was this antique thought? Was it antique thought refurbished for the modern age? Or was this a genuinely worldly thought, able to allow Zambia to engage with the modern world? You've got to declare your own terms, pride in your own terms, but you've also got, at the end of the day, to be able to interact with the world outside, particularly in the case of Zambia, which is very, very troubled by rebellion in the white South. Zambia gained independence in 1964. Immediately afterwards, in 1965, the white minority in southern Rhodesia, Zambia had been called Northern Rhodesia, but in southern Rhodesia, the white minority made a unilateral declaration of independence based on there never being, in the foreseeable future, a black majority. As rebel leader Ian Smith said, never in 1,000 years. But this posed a special problem for Kaunda and for Zambia. Independent, proud, wanting to help the cause of freedom, emancipation, and liberation. But the south of the country, southern Rhodesia, to the south, and to the south of southern Rhodesia, apartheid South Africa, they were now held in hostile hands. And Zambia basically owed its early incorporation into the world system to Cecil Rhodes. That's why Northern Rhodesia, Southern Rhodesia. But it meant that all the roads and all the railway lines went north to south. In other words, to get his exports out and to get his imports in, Kaunda had to cooperate in some way with the White South. The White South was threatened to choke him economically, just like that. And at the same time, he wanted to make a stand on behalf of liberation. At the same time, he needed to develop his country. It was a pretty uphill battle for him to develop his country. At independence, there were only 99 university graduates in all of Zambia. He had to run a country, a huge country, with 99 university graduates that he could appoint to important and strategic levels. One of his first priorities was to build a university. This wasn't any kind of luxury. It was an absolute necessity. I myself taught there. SOAS provided the external examiners. High standards were reached. It meant, however, not just filling the civil service with educated people, it reflected the thoughtfulness of Kaunda's approach. What kind of development did he want to bring to his country? Well, he actually wanted to build in Africa, in Zambia, a version of the British welfare state. The same British social democratic thinkers that helped build the foundations of the welfare state in Great Britain. Lasky, Tawney, Kaunda was their disciple. Even now, when you go to Lusaka, you'll see the suburbs that he began to build based on British social housing. He wanted to provide for all of his people. Not everything was a great success, in fact, far from it, because the country was underneath constant threat from the White South. International markets for its main export, copper, were volatile. It was almost impossible to plan from one year to the next. It all depended on the price of world copper. But probably what he had to face above all was the threat from the White South. He didn't have a large army. He had no air force. He had to create an air force. The Italian government helped with the training of Zambian pilots. But Kaunda forbade any of his soldiers or pilots to respond directly to White Rhodesian attack. And they were frequent, particularly as liberation leaders in what is now Zimbabwe would from time to time use Zambia as a safe haven. Joshua Nkomo, for instance, leader of one of the two main liberation factions, actually lived in Zambia for some time. The Rhodesians attacked where he was staying, gutted the house, and he himself managed to escape by the skin of his teeth. It meant a constant state of tension, and his armed forces were under instructions, as I said, not to fire back. Kaunda was of the view that even though he now had a small military, they were no match for the firepower of the Rhodesians, particularly if they were backed up by the white South African military. But he had to, as it were, anchor the standard principle. And this was anchored in the thought of Gandhi and his principles of nonviolent resistance. How did Kaunda know about Gandhi? Well, when Kaunda himself was hiding out from the British, he hid in the one sector of Lusaka that the British thought he would never be, because there was meant to be hostility between Africans and Indians. But the Indian community hid him in their own houses. They supported him. And with British armored cars patrolling the streets outside from time to time, he literally had to hide under beds at times. While he was hiding under beds, those looking after him would give him books to read. He read the works of Gandhi while he was hiding out from the British. So he imbibed this whole Gandhian philosophy of nonviolent resistance in the face of huge odds put against him by the white South. So here we have two ingredients already. You have British social democratic thought and the idea of a welfare state. You have Gandhian thought and the idea of Pacific resistance. And you also had a particular appeal to a philosophy which he called humanism, that is, the African humanistic spirit, based on what he put forward to be the principles of an African past, communalism. He didn't borrow from communism. He said our communal existence as a nation has got to be anchored in our own traditions. Now, to a certain extent, there was invention here. It had to be invention because Zambia is comprised of 72 different ethnic groups. That's 72 ethnic groups. That's 72 different languages. That's not counting the Indian, the Asian population, and that's not counting the remaining white population. Underdeveloped, few resources in terms of public administration with trained people. Binding all of that together meant a recourse to a particular version of African history and African culture that could unite everybody into a modern nation state that was able to develop economically and able to resist attack from the white South. And the final ingredient, the huge influence of missionaries. Kaunda wrote several books, particularly on non-violence, often co-authored with missionary mentors. He himself was deeply Christian. It was a religion that had a huge influence throughout all of Zambia. So a Christian humanism, Christian and human in the sense of its commitment to the Christological example. In other words, not so much based on doctrine and theology, but the example of Christ. How did Christ live? How did Christ respond to provocation? Remember, Jesus had said to Peter when Peter tried to defend him against the soldiers come to arrest him, Peter, put up your sword. Those who live by the sword will die by the sword. So Kaunda combined this particular Christian ethos, this Christological example, with this Gandhian thought. All of this was enough to persuade his people to hold together in the early years of development, from 65 right through to 1980, when finally southern Rhodesia became independent as Zimbabwe, holding them together despite the fact that the promises of development had to be curtailed because of the impossibility of development under the kinds of conditions that Zambia faced. In other words, Kaunda held the country together by thoughtful means. There was coercion. It became a one-party state, for instance. There were all kinds of mistakes along the way. One of the things that one must be mindful of is that throughout Kaunda's time, and even after Kaunda's time, there has never been a successful military coup in Zambia. There's never been a period when the soldiers have been in charge. There's always been a civilian government. It was underneath Kaunda that you had the first appointment of female ministers to his government. To honor what the Indians did to protect him, there's always an Indian minister in Kaunda's government. An attempt to be pluralistic. This often meant a balancing act. When you've got 72 different ethnicities, you've got to balance like crazy. It also meant the acceptance of English as the national official language, because how we're going to choose among 72 different languages. I hasten to add, that's languages, not dialects. So the building of a nation depended on the unification of the nation. The unification of the nation depended on the salvation of the nation against attack, against threat. He did all of this in the most thoughtful manner. The ingredients of this thoughtfulness are in the course that I myself teach, African Political Thought, here at SOAS. And the thought of the other great independence leaders was also reflected in this course. It's a serious effort to look deeply at the idea of the philosopher king, not always a successful philosopher king. Don't really like, and they don't really deserve that label. But the idea of thought in African politics, that itself is a repudiation of the still popular assumption that Africa is a continent without thought. Well, I hope that this brief taster is enough to at least whet your appetite to try to study the possibility of real, deep, engaged, and meaningful African political thought.